Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report. We have a bit to cover. We did the show earlier this week, of course, and we have news from Ukraine to Europe to Putin's recent speech to some Middle Eastern and Asian news, as well as some domestic news of the U.S. as the midterms come closer. But we'll start out, as almost always, with Ukraine. So, without further ado, would you like to get into it?
Yeah, so there is a lot going on, and we were initially going to record yesterday night, but I thought there's so much to get into, honestly, especially when you consider Putin's speech, Xi Jinping's recent consolidation of power in China. Uh, there's a lot going on, so I wanted to take a little bit of extra time to go over the source material. And then this morning, there was an attack by submersible drones. These could be boat or like mini submarines, and nine uh, unarmed, like unmanned flying drones. The drones, I guess most of them have been destroyed from the video footage that I've seen. But the Ukrainians were successful in attacking, at least from what I saw, it looks like they got one of the ships. Now, there's another video I saw where one of the drones is destroyed before it attacks the ship. There's another one where it veers away, narrowly missing like a small little fishing boat or tugboat. I don't know what it is. But the attacks did take place on civilian and military boats alike. And there is a very distant shot of what looks like an attack on the harbor, and tires of one of the docks are on fire and burning. So some of these boats were used in the escort of and safety for the transport of grains, and it's kind of funny that yesterday America was saying something about Russia stepping up its grain deal. So this deal basically is Russia gives their grain, and also Ukraine uses it sells their grains. And remember that whole fiasco in the spring and summer where they were clearing the mines that Ukraine had laid out before the invasion in order to transport the grain out of the Black Sea and to other ports around the world. Well, Russia has now said that deal is off. And I think there's a very good likelihood that this means that they're not going to allow any transports out of Odessa. This is definitely going to up the ante. The other thing is that the Russians claim that it was MI6 that was responsible in working with the Ukrainians to plan this attack. Remember that in, I think, 2020 or 2000 or late 2019, the British went into Russian territorial waters in Crimea. um, the UK is extremely committed into escalating the conflict, and they have been trying to escalate this conflict even before it began, at least 2 years before it began. So I would say that that's a likelihood. The other thing that this event has caused is the Russians have now claimed that MI6 was also partly responsible for the attack on the Kerch Bridge, and that they think that MI6 is also responsible for the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. So these are some, you know, big news items. This comes also on the heels of all three countries, Denmark, Germany, and Sweden, saying that they will not publish the findings. And then, strangely enough, the next day, I believe it was Thursday or Friday, that would be yesterday, Sweden saying that they're going to continue with their investigation. I don't understand why, because they're not going to publish the findings. Uh, it's been memory hold because I think most people understand that it was the US and some other Western country that could have done it and would have done it and had the motive to do it. There's no reason for the Russians to have done it when they had already turned off the taps anyways. So The escalation continues. Now, as far as the front lines are concerned, almost nothing has changed since our last episode, which aired Tuesday. The only small changes that have happened, again, have been in the east. There was a coordinated attack by the Russians using their air force and ground troops around Ugledar. They are now at the outskirts of one of the villages next to Ugledar, that's in the South Donetsk front. That part that goes all the way down and then starts going west towards Zaporozhye. The Ukrainians, since our last show, have tried several attacks. They've all been repulsed. There have been heavy losses. There are some Western sources, like what is it, the business publication? I forget the name of it now.
Business
In any
Insider?
case,
Or Bloomberg?
yes, that well, I don't know about Bloomberg, but Business Insider did talk about the losses. The losses are buried often deep down in the article, and they kind of contradict or call into question the whole
Remember
headline
that
in the first
Control
place.
F is always your friend when it comes to those sort of situations. If you want to find something like that, find something they bury, just Control F, type in whatever word you're looking for. I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you that, but I just feel the need to say that out loud.
Yeah. So the other area where the Russians continue to make small gains is up around the Liman front and around the Lysychansk front. As I said before, that whole northern section, of course, the Ukrainians took back. And so now it's more or less a straight line pushing west. There's a problem with this for the Russians because now they don't have any tactical advantage to take Slavyansk. The going through Sherwood Forest, as we spoke about in the summer, was very long. It was unsuccessful. And we'll get to General Liman. He was the one who was responsible for Tactical Group O in the Kharkov region. So the Russians have made some gains. They took 3 small villages towards Liman, and they retook Belagorovka, which is outside the northern boundary of Lysychansk, not far from Ruborshnye. It's been long abandoned. It has switched hands this year, I would say a minimum of 3 times, maybe 4. This might be the 4th time it has switched hands. Nobody's living there. I don't even think it's more than when people were living there. I don't even think it's more than 5,000 people. What advantage it gives for the Russians, I don't know. Almost every building has been destroyed, but I would say this is part of just a war of attrition. The other Putin and Shoigu have said that about 82,000 of the 300,000 are moving towards the front now. The last show, we said that there were already 16,000 reservists that have been put in. This is from the partial mobilization that was announced September 21st. So we are now well into the second month. And I would suspect after November 21st that there's a stronger likelihood that the Russians are going to make a big push. Where and how far they're going to go, I don't know. Now, to get to General Liman, as I said, he's the guy who was responsible for the O group in the north. His group is actually for the center command, but it's in north of the front. It's the north face. There were all kinds of rumors buzzing yesterday and today, and that apparently he was fired. As it turns out, I just got a message saying that he had resigned, and it was, people suspect it was partly due to pressure from criticism by Kadyrov and the CEO of the Wagner Group. Um, from the notes I saw from our special friend on Telegram, he talks regularly with some of the guys in Intel Slava. It looks like also soldiers under Liman were disappointed. But a lot of this can't be verified, so I'm just saying take this with a grain of salt. In any case, there had to have been some dissatisfaction, and I think Lapin knew. His name is Alexander Lapin, the general. I don't know if I got the name right earlier. Um, he knows that his time is up. I don't think, you know, I think he knows that the criticism has been extensive and it's been an embarrassment for Russia. Russia cannot really afford to lose any more territory without, I would say, a cost to morale. And based on the last two shows, I've mentioned that they're strengthening their front lines with these tank traps that are basically these concrete pylons, very big pylons, and massive trenches right next to this dual line of blocks in order to stop a rapid succession into Russian front lines. There were other criticisms, about basically being ineffective. You've let a column go through why uh, apparently he was there on the front line. Um, it to me, it sounds like there's a struggle within Russian high command about taking forces, because we've said from the beginning of this war that Russia is utilizing somewhere between 10 to 15% of its military power. That means basically, 85% or so of forces are dispersed in all other kinds of territories and theaters of action. Some are in Syria, some are, I don't know where, probably in the Arctic. I think the coup that nearly happened in Kazakhstan is the reason why those forces are tied up. And it may be why that there was a partial mobilization called. Because uh, if all of that was hunky-dory, Russia would not have to have called a mobilization. But I also think as this week has gone on with more and more, nuclear talk, dirty bomb, um, one side claiming the other is going to use a dirty bomb, take your pick. One country has tactical nukes, the other doesn't. The country without tactical nukes is more likely to use a dirty bomb. Um, in any case, so I think Russia, since the beginning of this war, has been prepared for the possibility of a much larger war, and for this reason, it does not want to commit any troops that have been stationed anywhere else. I think to further exemplify or to further bolster the point that I'm making here, there are more troops now moving into Belarus. It's not certain like what the Russians are going to do. There simply isn't enough forces to cut off the stream of supplies coming in from Poland into West Ukraine. I don't think. Are they there to uh, rattle sabers against the Americans and their NATO forces that are practicing in Lithuania and Poland? It could be. Uh, they could be there just to try to pull away Ukrainian troops from investing all their efforts in the east and in the south, because Ukraine at this moment is throwing everything that it's got. Now, there have been reports that uh, Polish and some Georgian fighters, but also English-speaking fighters in Kherson, are refusing to go to the front line. Does even now again take this with a grain of salt. I believe this part. Now, the wild part is coming up. Um, apparently, some of the nationalist enforcers in the Ukrainian army went to force these volunteers to go. And they had a fight, and basically the foreigners killed these nationalists. Did it happen? Did it not happen? I don't know. Uh, the thing is, there have been reports. Foreign fighters have left Ukraine before when it has become really dodgy for them. So there's nothing new about that. That's been going on in, especially since March 10th and onwards. We know that, right? So there's a possibility. Did this firefight happen? Maybe. It's interesting. It's interesting nonetheless. Um, is Shelling of civilians in Donetsk, of course, is still going on. There was an oil depot that was hit in Gorlovka, which is just north of Donetsk city. Um, there are small gains by the Russians continuing in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. They're focusing this week more on Avdiivka than they are in Bakhmut, because if they're able to soon take over Avdiivka, much of this shelling will stop. Again, uh, there are now tens of thousands of forces that are coming in. I'm going to guess that a lot of them are going to go to Kherson, because Kherson is a city that the Russians do not want to lose, despite what Western media is saying. And I will reiterate, there are now more reports that just like Kherson is evacuating civilians, so too are the Ukrainians evacuating civilians from Nikolaev. There was also a very interesting news article from the West that showed Russian families who had gone to Europe, well, Ukrainian families, sorry, that had gone to Europe when the war had started, but they have family in the Kherson region and they want to return to the Kherson region. I don't know if this was CNN or Political that published it, but I did see it, I believe, on Thursday, with photos and everything. They are in a hostel with bunk beds and so on. That style, I would probably guess they're in Poland, um, based on the photos I saw and based on my travels through Russia and Eastern Europe. So now that's about it, I think, that I can recall for the front lines and the battles that are going on. Russia said that based on today's attacks, that there will be heavy consequences for this. It considers this like a breach of an agreement to create safe passage for grain. Um, Grain and fertilizer, particularly fertilizer, is being held. Russia claims 80% of its fertilizer, 500,000 tons, that it's willing to donate for free to poor countries, is being held up mostly by the Lithuanians. And the cost for attacking the Kerch Bridge in Ukraine right now is that slightly over 40% of its uh, power grid is destroyed. Uh, Kiev was hit again yesterday night. The Russians are doing this kind of cat and mouse game where they're going to knock out certain generators. The generators will go back up, but what that does is it gives the Russians information about where to hit next in order to, because they have all these systems have like Soviet era backup systems. So there's a lot of redundancy just in case this happens. It's like there are 5-story apartment buildings have very thick concrete because the Soviets during the Cold War always thought that they would be invaded. So a lot of things were built to be, very difficult to knock down, a lot of redundancy in systems so systems could continue to work. And I think this is what the Russians are basically attacking right now. This is why they're doing it over and over again to find out where are the redundancies, physically speaking. Slovakia will now be supplying energy to Ukraine in order for Ukraine to make it out. Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, has asked for blankets. So the pressure is winding on right now. um, in Ukraine. You know, some people are convinced that there's going to be a dirty bomb. Like I say, I'm not sure one way or the other. Um, yes, Ukraine wants to drag NATO into this. I don't think America wants to be dragged into this. I think they
Absolutely
want,
not. I mean, and I'll get into
yeah,
this with some of my domestic American news, and actually, I'll just bring this part up
yeah.
in brief
Take
early.
take over
Um,
this part. I'm done basically for the frontline minutia minute. I'd like to have a back and forth with you
yeah,
about this.
yeah, certainly. Well, uh, in regards to when the next Russian offensive will be, I think November 28th is going to be a key date because if things do not change very quickly, that is the date when U.S. diesel will run out. I'm sure you've all
Mm,
seen that Tucker Carlson segment from the other
yeah,
night
yeah.
where he's
Just
just
saw it
saying,
this morning.
and like he was talking about how Raskin, that one congressman, was calling this a holy war or jihad against Russia's backwards values up against our progressive liberal values, blah, 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 blah. But as for the dirty bomb, while I believe there are elements in Ukraine who would love nothing more than to commit an act like that in order to escalate this war to get the West involved, I think even as far as Ukrainian radical goes, there are few and far in between. And I think as far as Westerners go, there are very few, if any, people in the West who are actually willing to commit more to this conflict than they already had. And with that, I'll just jump into another piece of domestic news. You have a group of Americans, well, you have a group of Americans being polled, and the data that came from that was the majority of them are growing increasingly frustrated with the conflict in Ukraine with no negotiations, and that they are becoming frustrated with sending aid with seemingly no end of the war in sight. And this is becoming a common sentiment among both parties and among even independents. And we had discussed last episode that there was a movement of Democrats in Congress who were calling on the administration to try to enter in some sort of negotiations with Russia at this point. But the main stymieing of negotiations has always come down to, well, Russia has to concede this, 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 and this before we even consider negotiating. That's come from the Ukrainians, that's come from the EU, that's come from Washington, where it's this consensus that in order to negotiate with Russia, Russia has to give up all its leverage in negotiations, which is a complete non starter. And this will only seem to continue. And just to get the actual numbers on that poll right here, it was about 47% of Americans who were polled from this said that they only support continuing to send aid to Ukraine if some sort of diplomatic effort is taken by the Americans to try to de escalate the conflict while sending the aid. And it was only about 32% who said that we need to support Ukraine even more and need to continue to support Ukraine, while around 37 or so percent were along the lines of saying that the U.S. has done enough and that we should throw the towel in and we've committed what we've needed to, and what happens happens, which is a surprising number there. And it is, despite what the media says and despite what a lot of people may say, something that is growing increasingly unpopular. Now, as for the midterms, which I'll get into before I get into Europe now, there
Well,
is.
if I could just
Yeah, go
quickly
ahead, go ahead.
interject, I think the pressure. I think the White House has already reacted to this to some extent, right? And I'm not talking about the fake liberal progressive wing of the Democrat Party writing some stupid letter that they were never serious about in the first place. I'm talking about General Mark Milley and Jens Stoltenberg, who is the chief of NATO, saying that if Ukraine loses this war, it's a defeat for NATO. We cannot afford to lose this war. Milley even said it's the end of the our order, our law and rules based order, which is,
The liberal
just their
order, yeah.
rules. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to say that they're already entrenching themselves by saying, "Oh, no, 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 no! If we do diplomacy, we're gonna, any diplomacy would be. I mean, the implication is any diplomacy will be a defeat, and if we are defeated, right, uh, then it's over for us." Which is interesting because so many journos, and we'll get into it, believe that any further amount of free speech on Twitter um, puts the entire civilization at stake. So
Oh yes,
that's
yeah. We'll get into that certainly, but you're correct that among a lot of the American elite, from the Pentagon, from the State Department, CIA, etc., even in the White House, believe that this war is crucial for the continuation of the global liberal order, which I would say, yes, it is.
it is.
Which also determines my view on how I've seen this war from day one, because they've been saying this since before this war started, and that has, once again, been the number one thing that has determined my view. I'm sure you've heard it, their losses, our wins, etc., 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 and at this point, I would say, I mean, not even at this point, I would say since the beginning of the war, I've always just been more anti-NATO than I've been pro-Russia. I haven't necessarily been anti-Russia or disdainful of Russia, but point being is, going into this, I've always wanted a NATO defeat because it needs to be brought to heel. It needs to be put in line. And also getting some of the news about that when we get into Europe, and some of those statements I said may be illegal in some parts of Europe very soon. But before we get into that, I would just like to cover some news about the American midterms and about what is on the horizon for the rest of the year in the United States. So, as I had mentioned earlier, there is a diesel shortage. I mentioned this last episode as well. They're predicting about, I believe they said, less than a month shortage, and that by November 28th, which is the Monday after Thanksgiving weekend, diesel shortages will have amounted to the point where there is no more diesel left in the country. And I got into this briefly last week and discussed what some of the implications of that may be. But I was listening to that Tucker Carlson clip, and he brought some things to my attention that I did not previously consider. Well, of course, shipping would be shut down in terms of ground travel with a lot of trucks and semi trucks. Those are diesel powered. Well, a lot of sea vessels are also diesel powered. And this is also on top of the pledges to Europe to send energy to them this winter because of the current crisis going on in Europe. So, exporting our energy, we ourselves are facing a shortage. You have a gasoline shortage impending in several states, and I'll just get a map of those states right here and just list those off briefly here. So, this is according to Mansfield, and it has moved the southeastern region into a code red when it comes to fuel shortages. So that includes Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. So they are, and again, that's a large chunk of the nation. That's almost half the East Coast right there, plus a little bit inland, are states that are in a severe shortage. Like I said, nationwide, they're expecting November 28th. And when the White House was asked, when the press secretary was asked about this, he had no answer. He said, "Oh, I'll take that and get back to you." So they didn't even have a canned answer prepared for something like this. I mean, whatever they would have said probably would have been just complete hot air, but they didn't even have that prepared enough to throw at the people who were expressing concerns about that. And journalists, for once, were doing their job and actually grilling them on that. Now, of course, the journalists did not push further after that, so after a certain point, I suppose they've only done so much. And these are just some figures in terms of inflation. Now, this is one person on a post that went viral posting their shopping receipt, and they were comparing it from 3 years ago. So milk is up almost 80%, toothpaste 43%, Isopropyl alcohol up 63%, whereas the national level only says about 8.2. Now, of course, that averages out. That will be something that doesn't follow national trends, but it can be very safely said, in my opinion at least, that the national number of 8.2 is an understatement to try to appease the population, to try to keep them calmer than they should be in a situation like this.
Hmm. If you'll forgive me, there
Yeah, go
is
ahead.
one or two pieces of news on Russia that one of them I've neglected for two episodes in a row, and that is, and it will tie in with the Musk deal. Uh, that is last week, or maybe 10 days ago, the Russians launched a satellite. This satellite will be used to scramble or attack Starlink. Um, Musk had already said that the Russians are gaining in their ability to disrupt it. And this ties in again with Ben Wallace flying to the US uh, the same day that there were, and he had later admitted it, that communications were compromised. Now, I said that why on earth would he mention something like that? And I felt like that can't be true because no one would ever do something so stupid. But on second thought, it might be that they are that stupid, and it is a way to gain sympathy points. They need to keep Russia looking like this dangerous foe that is after the entire West, and all of the West's important democratic values will just wither away if there is a peace settlement reached in Ukraine where Ukraine loses 20% of its territory, and so on and so on. It's possible. Anyways, the other bit of news is Ramdan Kadyrov is very upset. He's called for a jihad basically against Ukraine, and that's because in the Kherson region there was a post of Chechens that was attacked by MLRS missiles or rockets, if you will, and this killed 23 members and wounded 58. So he's furious about this. Um, he's a very outspoken and emotional guy. The speech back that a few weeks ago that Putin gave at the in the St. George building, you could see that he's welling up with tears and keeping his head up so that they don't drip down his face. Um, anyways, I'd forgotten about that, especially the satellite. I've been meaning to say that for quite some time. Thank you.
Oh, certainly. And again, we'll still have the Putin speech to get into, but I'll hold off on that until I get through some of the midterm news here. Now, what we have is the elections on the 8th, and I'll put it this way, because there's so many House districts to deal with, I'll just give you a general prediction. I believe the Republicans will take the majority in the House of Representatives. I'm not going to go through district for district, at least not at this time. But the Senate is a different story. I did actually take some time and put together a prediction map on that, and I'll explain some of my more controversial choices with that, or just some of the swing races in general. So we have right here, I'm predicting a 52-48 split in favor of the Republicans. Ohio, I was discussing a little bit over the past couple episodes, I believe goes Republican. And you just look at the trends, you look at how many points Trump won the state by in both 2016 and 2020, and you also look at the lineup of the candidates and just the general approval rating of the president at this time. More often than not, midterm elections are a referendum, or should I say, opinion poll, more appropriately, on the performance of the president. Now, looking at several of these states, Biden is at a slight disapproval rate with just over 50 so percent of the population disapproving him, whether that be like a 52, 53, 54. That holds true through most of these states. So, Ohio, I put in the column, I think Vance is going to win there. Pennsylvania, I watched the debate this week. It was just put a single word to it, pathetic on that part. Now, Pennsylvania has been one of the more absurd races, which has been why it's fun to follow. So on the Republican side, you have professional snake oil salesman Dr. Oz. And on the Democrat side, you have John Fetterman, who's this faux tough guy who likes to dress like a working class guy. He's always wearing like a sweatshirt or a t-shirt or something. And recently, within the past few months, of course, he did suffer from a stroke, which has severely impaired his cognition. And he even admits that. So, I watched this debate, and he was more incoherent than Biden. And Biden, of course, I'm no medical professional, so I can't say definitively, but Biden is somebody who shows signs of at least having a mind dulled by age. Not that Biden was ever particularly bright in the first place, but Fetterman, a man in his late 40s, early 50s, is more incoherent and more stumbling over his words than Joe Biden is. Dr. Oz wasn't particularly stellar, but a lot of the opinion polls after the debate showed that Oz won it. As I said, Biden also has the disapproval rating in Pennsylvania that is over a majority, and he is also expected to come to the state of the campaign. Now, some may say that there may be some dubious things, and of course, I don't want to violate any YouTube terms of service, so I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there's people who allege that, but I'm saying that even under those circumstances, which certainly do not exist, I still give Pennsylvania to the Republicans. I still think Oz will win that race. Now, moving down to Georgia. Georgia has been a perpetual race to the bottom between Republican Herschel Walker and Democrat Raphael Warnock. Now, Georgia is also a state that they expected dubiousness in last election, which, once again, I, of course, deny wholeheartedly. But it has been shown that Walker has been mired in scandal, and that's particularly on the question of abortion. He's campaigning on a abortion ban on the federal level. However, it is revealed that he allegedly paid for two abortions from affairs that he had. I don't know how true that is, but it
Mhm.
seems to have picked up popular support in terms of being believed. So that has damaged him on a certain level. Not to mention, neither of these men are too articulate, bright, or astute, and I'm not just saying that from a perspective of that they are both so happen to be black men. No, it's just that neither of them seem very intelligent at all. And frankly, I mean, I would say the same about the race in Pennsylvania as well. So, just as a race to the bottom thing, I would give Georgia to the Democrats this time. And not to mention, Atlanta is unfortunately in Georgia becoming more and more of a center of influence, so they're having more of a sway on the statewide vote. However, I still would give the Republican the governor race at that point. Then moving to Arizona and Nevada. I'll start with Arizona because it's less controversial. I think Masters takes it. It's been neck and neck between him and Kelly, and I think he actually does have what it takes to pull it off. He has been probably the most, dare I say, Trump-like and populist candidate in all of this. And Mark Kelly, while he does have the background, he has somewhat of a moderate background, somewhat of a respectful background. He was in the space program, and he's actually married to the woman who there was the assassination attempt on. I believe that was right before the 2010 midterms. It was that incident, so he does have some name recognition. He does have some notoriety with that. And of course, he was also elected in a special election, which is never really a good sign when it comes to something like that as well, because they tend to be ones who have to fill a seat. And Arizona was also an interesting case because their other Senate seat was filled by the governor after the death of John McCain. But Arizona, I would generally have to give to the Republicans. That may just be my personal bias, but Masters does seem like a strong enough candidate to flip the state. Not to mention the state has been trending purple, but still leaning red. And if I had to compare it to anything, I think its trends going blue can be compared to, for example, how Indiana voted for Obama in 2008. Now, moving on to Nevada, which is probably the one where most people disagree with me. All the experts say it's safe blue, but there was a split within the Democratic Party, within the Democratic primary, although they have seemingly rallied around one candidate, which is Catherine Cortez Masto, up against Republican Adam Laxalt, there still was that significant split in the Democratic Party. Now, there's no other significant Democrat on the ballot or no significant third party, but in my opinion, there's enough party infighting in order to deliver the seat to the Republicans, which once again puts it at a 52-48 majority. Now, let's say this plays out. Let's say my election map plays out even to a 51-49 majority. Let's say I'm wrong about Nevada or Arizona or Pennsylvania, or just wrong about one or two of these. And maybe the Senate goes back to the 50-50 that's at now, but I believe that we'll see at least a 51 seat majority out of the Senate when this election is over. Now, aside from a couple, and by that I mean probably just J.D. Vance, a lot of these are completely in line with the establishment on things like Ukraine and most of the foreign policy issues. In fact, as you were speculating, and I tend to agree with, a lot of these Republicans will probably try to do a little bit of a showmanship and upstage their Democrats, saying, we support Ukraine more, we're tougher on Russia, falling hook, line, and sinker for that bait that is always set out for conservatives that, oh, you think we're not tough? We're the tough guys. We're going to stand up to our foreign adversaries but do nothing at home. Blah, 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 blah. You've heard this story a million times before. Now, with those opinion polls, that may change. They may be a bit more hesitant. I doubt aid to Ukraine is going to cease in any sense, but what I think the reaction to the midterms, if it does go to the Republicans, as I do personally expect in both House and Senate, especially House, I would say Senate's a bit more iffy, but I think at least the status quo will be maintained in the Senate at the very least. I don't see the Democrats being able to take a definitive majority, a 51 seat majority. Now, they effectively have a majority right now with the vice president's tiebreaker vote, but at the end of the day, that's only does so much, and that's also a very costly move in terms of political capital to use over and over. Although they do have enough Republicans that they can flay off to defect, but I still stick to my 52-48 prediction with these particular states going this way. The state I'm most unsure about is Georgia because it is such a race to the bottom that one candidate constantly outdoes the other in the worst possible way. And like I said, I don't see any way Walker can pull this off. He's too mired in scandals, and he really, in my now I could be wrong. If we have any audience from Georgia or any audience who are particularly savvy with electoral politics, please correct me if I'm wrong there. But I just don't see Georgia going back to the Republicans at least this election cycle. Now, in terms of the regime's reaction, I have long been speculating that this would be used as an excuse to put Biden out to pasture, whether that be through a 25th Amendment scenario, whether that be through an illness scenario, whether that be through a variety of different things. And I am starting to waver on that. Biden has been making less and less public appearances. He has been quieter out of the spotlight after the last few speeches he's given, namely the off-ramp speech and the Dark Brandon speech, quote unquote. But with that being said, he seems to have been enough of a passive force, at least at this point, where they can still keep him quiet and trot him out only when they absolutely need to. But I do believe the reaction from the administration, from the regime as a whole, if this does happen, not necessarily because they fear what Republican politicians can do, but they fear that it is a opinion poll on their popularity, that they'll punish the voters more so than the actual politicians, whereas the
Yeah, that's a
politicians
great point.
are more just like I said, a few exceptions aside, they're more just a proxy for dissatisfaction, much like Trump, where you don't really expect them to do anything, but at least it might stonewall them for a while. I expect them to stop taking the measures they've done to lower fuel prices almost immediately. I think the Democrats win, they will continue with the fuel prices through Thanksgiving weekend. Now, the diesel shortage does present a bit of a complication to that. I don't know how that will play out, but in terms of just like gasoline, in terms of just average person travel, they will probably cut that off almost immediately if they lose control of Congress. Because at that point, what's to lose? And they have about a 2 month lame duck term before the new session of Congress is sworn in, which is always at the beginning of January of the next year. So they'll have November and December to ramrod a bunch of stuff through, which is probably exactly what they're going to try to do. Probably shove through as many aid packages to Ukraine. Hell, they might even try to touch the abortion issue on a federal level if it goes that way. I couldn't say for certain, but they'll pull out all the stops they can with the power they have left remaining because that's what they always do, especially the Democrats, who are a much more effective political party than the GOP is. And by effective, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing, but I'll just say they're much better at achieving their goals than the Republicans are at achieving their supposed goals. So that's my general outlook for the midterms. A slight Republican victory, I don't really think it will do much, but it will once again contribute to the idea that the regime is becoming less and less legitimate by the day, and that people are more and more dissatisfied, even if the candidates they're electing don't reflect that. But just the fact that they're from the wrong party, have the wrong colored jersey on, will get the message across.
Yeah, I mean, it's even if it was a massive Republican victory, it will be the same story as the Tories, where the Republicans and the Tories are both, uh, I mean, frankly, they're reactionary, right? They are there to react to whatever the liberals are doing and leading. Democrats or New Labour or liberals in Canada and so on and so on.
Yeah, just a bunch of
They
DR3 rhetoric.
Yeah, they have no vision really, except lower taxes sometimes. Even that's getting adjusted. I would say that, like you say, the only problem for the Democrats is that the Republicans are kind of a lightning rod, um, for dissatisfaction in the country, particularly from conservatives and even a good deal of independent voters. But whether there's a massive victory or not, nothing will change. Uh, that Brandon speech that we saw, what was it, in September,
Yeah,
early
mid
September,
September, thereabout.
mid September? Yeah, like, I mean, they've made up their minds that these people are a danger, and then you have like the crazy story just yesterday with Paul Pelosi being attacked by a nudist at 2 a.m. with a hammer and saying, "Oh, he's a QAnon guy." Meanwhile, like he's actually a nudist and was part of a nudist wedding. Reminds me of the Viking helmet guy that stormed, the Capitol.
Ah, the Q shaman.
The, yeah, the Q shaman, right? There's this crossover of like liberal and conservative conspiracy theorists. Now, we don't know if this guy's an actual conspiracy theorist. We don't know if this narrative is just being invented whole cloth. What we do know is that, you have a near invalid president and you have the third most powerful person in America. I mean, she is the only one flying or going anywhere, whether it's to provoke China and by flying to Taiwan or going to Kiev. She's like, she's at least has her marbles. The idea that this guy could sneak in, right, naked, like, it's so preposterous.
You know what this story reminds me of?
Mm.
The Jussie Smollett case.
Yes, yes, yes. It's so made up, right? But they are always going to do this, right? Because there is a kind of paranoia that is very real, right? Like, the Republican Party itself has no power. The problem is they know that, like, all justification for a liberal democracy is post hoc. They're going to do what they're going to do. Then they'll go into their book of neoliberal dogma and pull out the parts that justify the actions that they're doing, no matter how contradictory they are, right? And that's what happens with this regime, right? So they are going to say, you have to ignore that there was hardly any security. And there's even talk of, like, there was a check that was done on him by security that was phoned in. I mean, who did that? So all of that will evaporate because Political came out with an article saying that he was this kind of like this Q shaman guy. They didn't say Q shaman, but that's the first guy I thought of. And again, the hyper focus on the portion of the population that will not go along, even though they have all the institutions, they've won most of the laws, they seem incredibly troubled that there's a portion of the population who, in their private thoughts, disagree. Um, I don't know. They're not going to convince them. About 38% of the population believes 2020 was stolen, right? So they're seeking legitimacy, and their institutional power is not threatened, but I would say demonstrations and social media are a threat to them, which is very interesting in light of the war and in light of Musk's final purchase of Twitter, and the rapid firing of several people in high positions, including the CEO, R. Wog.
And
What a name.
the let's just say commissar of Twitter, the one who approved the Trump suspension. So
Yeah. She's
it,
gone.
it it does it does bring up some interesting questions about, especially if he does something before the midterms. Now, I if you're ready to get into Musk, I have quite a bit to say.
Yeah. I mean, Medvedev had a post a few days ago where he said, congratulations on taking over Twitter, and hopefully you'll get rid of like rigid ideological points of view that are restricting free speech, something to the words of that effect. But then he says, now do something about Starlink in Ukraine. So that's basically the deal, right? Right? Like, um, I just saw an ad for the Marines that was less gay than all the other ads that we saw in
Yeah,
2020,
it's like one of the ones
2021.
that looked like they were from like 2010, 2011.
Yeah, so they have like women, uh, driving and attacking with HIMARS, presumably like Russian schools in eastern Ukraine and so on. So, but there was nothing except for that, which a lot of military will once in a while feature a female. There wasn't really any woke stuff, right? And I personally think,
No, it wasn't that one animated one that they put out.
yeah,
That was probably a lot like last year, beginning of this year.
yeah,
No, it was before the war,
it
because I
was
remember.
before the war, yeah.
Yeah,
2021, 2020. There were a few of them. But I don't remember which year it was, but it was like you say before the war. They were definitely not in 2022. Uh, so I would say that the deal is, look, we'll give the conservatards their free speech back if you keep Starlink going. And remember, we said even with the beginning of this war, expect the regime to offer you some little tidbits here and there where you're going to feel like, this civilization ain't so bad. I think we're turning it around.
yeah, like the Roe v.
What
Wade
what
thing and
what they need is
that too.
conservative young men to die. They need their support. They need the conservative wing to be more supportive of this war than just the liberals, right? Um, because this will tie in with Putin's speech, basically, where the Western media acknowledges that his speech. Now they think he did it basically to troll the West and get Western conservatives to like him. The thing is, Western conservatives have liked him for a long time. That's possible nonetheless. I do think it's the third world that he's really appealing to, because those places actually do have traditional societies to begin with. In any case, yeah. So I think that's the deal. That's the deal. He's going to be in charge of Twitter. Twitter is going to be free again, and now there'll be some kind of a push, depending on how long this war is going to go, where they're going to work very hard to get conservatives on board. So you're going to see more NAFO stuff, not less.
Uh, I, you're right. I hate that you're right, but you're right. Now, in terms of some things with Musk, to tie that back to some of the electoral politics, because I think you laid out a pretty good case about the bones that they're throwing to conservatives, whether that be free speech online, whether that be our military ads aren't complete garbage, whether that be Roe versus Wade being overturned. Yeah, all that. And I completely agree with that. But just getting into some of the domestic news, and perhaps they are grooming us for a Trump 2.0 so he can come in and continue to throw that red meat while doing everything they want, as we've previously speculated, because I personally think, not that I think somebody like DeSantis or whatever would be better, but I personally think Trump 2024 is a complete farce. And
Yeah, I do too.
yeah, and I mean, I
He's
think
not going to do anything. Like, what's
no,
the point?
absolutely not. I mean, it might be kind of funny, but even the original charm will probably have worn off by
Hmm.
2024 at that point. And like I said, I'm not telling you to support DeSantis or vote Democrat for accelerationist reasons, whatever. I mean, hell, I'll probably end up voting for Trump just for the delegitimization factor. I might not
For the
even vote
funny
that
tweets
election.
he got us.
Yes, yes. but but with that being said, they're going to do this. Now, Musk has said that he's not going to lift any suspensions until he gets his moderation council together, which he said is going to be people of diverse and conflicting viewpoints. So, trying to bring back this illusion of a neutral free speech platform, which I think he'll mostly be able to do just for the sake of
Because they'll let
that's
him do it.
yeah, that's what they need at this time. They need some sort of bone to be thrown to the conservatives. Look, you can have 2016 Twitter back. Look, you can make fun of the journalists. Look, you can do X, Y, or Z. Now, please send all your money and your sons to go fight in whatever new theater we have opened up at this time. Now, of course, they'll crack down on all of that once you start posting things that question the narrative too much, but it's going to be what they allow it. They're probably going to unsuspend Trump. They're probably going to do whatever. Now, we're about, let's see, by the time this airs, which will be on a Saturday, we're about a week and a half out from the midterm elections. I doubt Trump will be unbanned since then, and even if he was, I doubt his impact would be great enough to really have any effect on the elections at hand. But going forward, whether that be special elections, whether it be 2024, it is going to shift the narrative because Trump, for all his faults, was able to weaponize the internet in a way and was able to create a popular or semi-popular movement, I should say, by using memes, by using Twitter, by again just repeating what he would do in 2016 to a lesser extent in 2020. And like I said, by 2024, in my opinion, the charm will be completely gone out of that. It's just going to be something that is very played out at that point. But it's still going to be enough to swing enough people. So you have that, and I would say, and I'd have to see how these midterms go, that there is a rehabilitation of Republicans underway at this time, where they would allow them to once again take those more right wing positions for the sake of the regime. That now that they've pushed the radicalism for so long so far since second term Obama, they're going to let the Republicans come in and play the moderate while shedding the radicals because, again, they've been the useful idiots. They've done what they've needed to do. However, it's not exactly going to be conservative. For example, somebody had pointed out after the Oz debate that Dr. Oz is more pro gay marriage than Barack Obama was in 2008 or even 2012. So they've pushed the Republicans to the left on enough of the issues that matter while letting them attack some of the more radical issues. And I think the LGBTQ CIA is a great thing where most Republicans are ready to affirm gay marriage in federal law, but hey, just don't wear women's clothing and go into the women's bathroom because that's where we draw the line.
It's just show respect
Yeah.
to the troops.
Oh no. But
Show some damn respect to the troops.
oh, but yeah, exactly. So they're going to let them play the so-called moderate role, and again, I don't have it on hand, but it goes back to that return to tradition meme where it's the modern pride flag versus the traditional one. It's like
Yeah.
Democrat, Republican, and that really is what's going to be. They're going to play up to some cultural issues. They'll probably let civic nationalism become socially acceptable, and they'll probably try to push that after once again years of pushing things that are against the actual stock of America insofar as that still actually exists. But it's going to be where Trumpism, something that would have been considered fringe, extreme, and insane in 2016, and even I would say pushing in 2020, is going to be something that is socially acceptable by 2024, so long as it serves the right means, whether that be hawkishness on foreign policy, which is going to be the primary one that they're going to use them for, to be the foreign policy hawks, and also to take the fall if these foreign campaigns inevitably fail. So, or I should say,
Mhm.
when these foreign campaigns inevitably fail. Similar to what they did with the Bush movement. And you could, I mean, I'm not comparing Trump to Bush in any way, but you can see this. In the early 2000s, and even in the 90s, the Republicans were campaigning on a constitutional amendment to affirm marriage between one man, one woman. They were, again, pushing federal laws on abortion. Now they're starting to do that kind of thing again. And they were pushing all these very culturally conservative things. For example, wanting to teach intelligent design schools, or, uh, again, things that would be completely unthinkable today. And then you had Bush come in. He campaigned a lot on the socially conservative, like the compassionate conservative issues. He gets in. He becomes known for Iraq and Afghanistan. His legacy is tarnished. You get Obama, and he undoes whatever social conservative work was done by the Republicans in that era. But that they were only allowed to do because they pushed forward the issues on Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, they're going to continue to do that. They're going to let Trumpism, in a much more watered down sense, become something that is socially acceptable. You can be a civic nationalist as much as you want. You can say we need to stop illegal immigration so long as we let in more legal immigrants. And hell, even if they're feeling really generous, they might let you curtail some of the legal immigrants. But this is all going to be contingent that you are an imperial loyalist, and that is where they draw the line. So a lot of people who are more genuine in these issues are going to get sidelined. They are going to be left in the dustbin. And I mean, this is really, in my opinion, now I could be completely wrong, the last stop that they're pulling to try to salvage the empire to any degree, which is ironically enough what you could say the Trump movement of 2015, 2016, 2017 was about. And now that they're retroactively trying to apply this, let's see, at that point it would be 8 years later.
Right. There is a timeline that we can look at that I think maps out very well the kind of transformation that had to happen to the Republicans and the Democrats, but also happened to Labor and the Tories. This is a process that's been going on all over the Anglosphere and probably in the larger West. So I would say Nixon and Carter represent the last of the ideological differences before the rest before the new programming, as it were. Okay. So Reagan is the first to begin reforming the Republican Party. He lets in millions of Mexicans. He wants to give them visas and citizenship to becoming American citizens very quickly.
But also
Remember,
keep
there's
in
that.
mind his track record as a governor when it came to things like the no-fault divorce, the gun
Yeah.
control issue, and things like that as well.
Yep. Exactly. Right, and his stupid wife obsessed with horoscopes.
Wait, really? I did not know that about Nancy
You
Reagan.
didn't know that? She's a complete idiot. It's a
Nancy
complete
Reagan, the
flake.
original astrology thought.
Yeah, it's racism for women. So, so you have him, right, and he's going to push business, lower taxes. Okay, that's not totally out of the ordinary, but he's going to he wanted like markets that geared towards children or the individual, not the family unit. That was what was radical, right? Now, um, people took their eye off the ball because, he helped bring down the Soviet Union. Same dynamic happening now, right? Very similar dynamic, right? Look, conservatives, I'm destroying Russia. Look, look, look. Right? That's like an American obsession, right? That's a Western Anglo obsession. Um, so then you have uh, Clinton. Clinton is the first reformed Democrat. He's adopting certain Reagan economics, and he's tweaking them. And shortly after him, you have Tony Blair. Tony Blair is the first like totally reformed labor, and he's a very effective leader. He's even more effective than Clinton. And then Blair becomes the template for both Tories and New Labour from that point on. Cameron is he's Labour in a Tory suit, right? And this is why Rishi didn't get sacked, because I mean everybody knows like there was a hit to get rid of Liz Truss. I don't care about Liz Truss. I don't care that it happened. I'm just saying that this this fiasco about like not increasing taxes and increasing spending is literally what Rishi did in 2022 and 2021, where he signed off on massive spending, giving Homes First £200 and £600 in June or July of this year. Like she wasn't doing anything that he wasn't doing, but he's got connections with Goldman Sachs. He used to work for Goldman Sachs. Anyhow, the point is, uh, it will keep the Tory party alive because it's reforming to become more like Labour. And I think something like that is happening with the Republicans. It's not been as easy in the States as it has been in Britain. Um, that's where the snag is in the fabric. That's the difficult part, right? Is it, and I think this is what worries American elites so much, is this program has not gone as well as they had hoped. And it's not because they don't control all the institutions like education, media, politics. It's not that or any of the intelligence agencies or the Pentagon. It's just that the public is not going along with it. And again, it's a liberal democracy. They are obligated to act like one to some degree, to the point that it's believable for a lot of the masses. And this is why they have to support a guy like DeSantis. Even though I don't care about DeSantis, I don't think he's good. um, he is enough to trigger the liberals. And that's what has made this process difficult for them. But that's my big bird's eye view of this dynamic.
Yeah, I can't really dispute any of that. And yeah, you said it just about everything I would have said, and probably a little bit more as well. So it's going to continue down that trend until we really reach a breaking point in the Anglosphere, which will probably be sooner rather than later, at least in my opinion. And
Yeah,
I can only imagine. I mean, this diesel shortage, and maybe this is
yeah.
being overplayed, maybe this is being fear mongered about, but this changed my analysis on so many things, because I thought that at least what we would have here is continental Europe gets pillaged at the expense of keeping the United States afloat for a few more years, at least until they could attempt to get Biden reelected or do some sort of restructuring. But at this point, if I'm to believe everything I'm hearing about the diesel shortage, I don't know what the hell is going to
Hmm.
happen to this country. I don't know what the hell is going to
Yeah,
be.
Britain's got 8 days now.
Uh, yeah, and then yeah, you consider it's worse there. It's worse in continental Europe, and at this point, it's either collapse or accept the political settlement over the Ukraine conflict. And I don't know if the people in charge of the West, especially considering Raskin's comment about this being a crusade and a holy war against Russia's retrograde values, or whatever the hell he said.
Right.
I
And you know what's interesting is when the war started, remember we started getting copies, Russian prisoners of war. They had with them, with their passports, this statement, right? That said
yes,
that you are fighting against evil, you're fighting against satanic forces, right? Um, Dugin a few days ago gave a speech in, I believe, in St. Petersburg. It might have been Moscow, but he gave a speech, and huge attendance by the Orthodox Church of Russia was there, where he reiterated that we are fighting a satanic force. Kadyrov said we are fighting a satanic force. There are photos from like April that I saw where Chechens are saying we are the brigades fighting for Jesus Christ, even though that they're Muslims.
For now,
And
at least.
yes, so true. So you have this is a kind of response by the U.S. It is an ideological war. This is why you have like liberals who are convinced that if they lose in Ukraine, their entire ideological edifice will collapse.
And in a way, they're right.
Yeah, that's why they're willing to go to the World War III. That's why Liz, I mean, Liz Truss says whatever she said. Uh, by the way, there was an article about her feeling that her phone was compromised by the Russians as well. This article came out, I think, yesterday or today. The first time that the Russians said that there was going to be a dirty bomb in Mykolaiv is the day that Ben Wallace flew to Washington. Anyhow, I can't prove one thing or the other. I just think that's interesting. But yeah, Liz Truss saying, if the nuclear missiles were launched at you, like, why would Russia launch them at you? What would you do? Or I forget how the question was phrased. It was more open-ended than that. It was simply the think. Correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. Basically, if it came to using the nukes, would you? And she says, it's my duty. I consider it my duty.
Avenge the Queen.
Avenge the Queen, yeah. Remember, I was your prime minister when during the ceremony when she died. Did you really want to have a Hindu?
They just needed a white woman to be in that position. Like that's
I
it.
I sometimes think that's it.
I mean, I'm almost certain. I'm 99% sure that was the case.
Yeah. Don't blackmail the conservatives. We might need them in the war next year.
Yeah. They couldn't have the Circassian Turk oversee it. They could not have the Dravidian oversee it. They had it. Look, they would have accepted even a white man. Now, like I said, Boris Johnson is white. He's a Circassian Turk, but they would have accepted.
Yes.
They would have accepted a white man, but they needed a white woman, okay? Because I don't know. At least in the American context, those are the only people. Now, again, I know it's different in the British context, but again, when it comes to the sentimentalism of the British monarchy, you need a white woman there. That's all you need.
Yeah.
Uh, but with that being said, I do have some European news if you're ready to get into that.
Yeah.
Now, I would like to inaugurate our European news with something very special. I sent you this. I think this image encapsulates everything you need to know about American-European relations at this time. I'm gonna leave that up for a while. Let you all soak that in. I can't get over that image. So to tie together some of the Ukrainian news with the European news, there is some news regarding Hungarians in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian authorities have made the decision to erase the Hungarian culture in Transcarpathia or Zakarpattia, where they were taking down the Hungarian symbols and replacing them with Ukrainian symbols. Now keep in mind the language laws that were passed by the Ukrainian government to try to suppress the Russians also did affect groups like Romanians, like Hungarians, like Poles, like Rusins, who are all still living in the country, and don't necessarily see themselves as ethnically Ukrainian. Now, it's a bit muddled because the Ukrainian census does like to inflate numbers, and they do like to downplay the presence of the Western minorities, so they have also fallen victim to this now. Hungary, under Orban, has, in those uncertain terms, been a neutral player at the very least on the Ukraine conflict and has wanted to see this not escalate by any means necessary. The Romanians, although they have been supportive of Ukraine, and you had the defense minister who was forced to resign, they have also been hesitant about this, and I'm sure that's in no uncertain part due to their co-ethnics that live in Ukraine that are being affected by these laws. Now, getting into more European news, you have Poland, which is being a welfare queen, is the only way I can put it. Except not this time. It's usually towards Germany. This time, they were demanding Russia pay for damages from the Soviet occupation, to which Medvedev, once again, had a wonderful response. And I just want to read this response verbatim because
Yeah, it was good.
it was cracking me up. So this is just straight from the Telegram channel Russian Head. Just going to be reading it verbatim. Dmitry Medvedev reacted to the statement of the Polish Foreign Ministry about compensation for the damage caused by the Soviet Union. One can react two ways to the degenerates from the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs who demand compensation from Russia for military losses. We could either pass them a bill for everything that the USSR transferred to Poland during the period of socialism, and that's hundreds of billions of dollars, or we can tell them to wipe themselves their filthy calculation sheet. It is known due to the sanctions that toilet paper in the EU has risen in price. Which, I mean, look, I'll be honest. I think at this point, we've all underestimated Medvedev. I think he has far outdone Putin. I think
Yes.
I think he has to be Putin's successor at this point. Now I know people speculated that for years, but at this point, I don't think there's really any other candidate to succeed Putin than that. The man has become, I don't even know the word for it, a firebrand, but he's got a sharp tongue that I would have not expected of somebody like him before this war started. And he's just been consistently hitting it. I'm sure he has a great PR team, but he's almost taking on, and I know this is very cliche to say, a very Trumpian approach to Russian politics at this point, where he'll just come out and say that things. And I would say, honestly, if anyone is starting to fill the shoes of a Zhirinovsky, it might actually be him. And hell, that might be the reason. You notice he didn't start doing this until after Zhirinovsky died.
Hmm.
So I do think he's taken up that role of the straight man at that point, or I suppose Putin would be the straight man, but he's taken up that role of the exaggerated character to fill Zhirinovsky's shoes, which does make me question what will become of the Liberal Democratic Party. Will it become an actual right-wing opposition in Russia? I don't know actually, and I suppose time will be uh, give us the answer with that. So to go back to Hungary, we have some news out of there where Orban has vowed to defend Hungary from the European Union as it is at odds with them on a number of issues, particularly Ukraine and the social liberal issues. So you have had Orban come out, and this was at the 66th anniversary of the 1956 uprising, in which case he did make, as you would expect from something like Orban, comparisons to the Soviet Union, to the EU, saying that just one occupation force for another, which is pretty brazen rhetoric
Yeah.
considering it's from the European Union. But I mean, no other than Viktor Orban would have said that. Now, a couple years ago, you could have said, and even last year, you could have said he is a middleman. He is somebody who walks the tightrope. But in light of Ukraine, considering the fact that he doesn't want to get involved further, and that he presumably has some interest in overseeing the well-being of the ethnic Hungarian minorities in Ukraine, he has, I would say, almost completely burned bridges with the European Union, and he has painted an even larger target on his back than he previously had. And at this point, and especially with a speech like this, I would say he has more or less declared himself anti-European Union, and that Hungary is only there because it has to be, because it's stuck in there at this point. I'm sure the aid is great for the Hungarian economy. I'm sure it's great getting however many billions of euros that they get in aid, but at this point, Hungary is in the European Union because it really has no other choice, because leaving isn't feasible. But he has made it clear that Hungary is more or less an anti-European Union country, which I think a lot of people were speculating at the time. I always thought he would play the very balanced role, not take sides too strongly, but Ukraine has forced his hand. Now, I have no doubt that the social issues such as the LGBTQCIA thing has played into that, but he was able to resist that, and the European Union was able to tolerate that. But since the outbreak of the war, and once again to echo Raskin's statements about this being a holy war, any dissent, any deviation cannot be tolerated. And Hungary is too deviant, so they're going to crack down on both of them at this time. But even a relatively minor player within the European Union not supporting Ukraine, not dedicating everything it had, not sending half its tank fleet like Poland did, is something that is seen as completely unacceptable. And frankly, I think it's a matter of when rather than if they're going to try a regime change in Hungary. Now, they already have, but those have been soft attempts like color revolutions. But I think it's getting to the point, especially if the war in Ukraine goes any worse for them, that they're going to try a hard regime change, that they're going to try a Maidan style revolution in the streets rather than just peaceful protest. They're going to get into the outright violence in the street, try to convince figures within the military or other structures of power to have a forceful takeover of Hungary, because I do think it's getting to that point. I think Orban, I wouldn't say he's flying too close to the sun, because I think for the time being he is secure in his position, but 2023 is going to be a pivotal year. It's going to be, in my opinion, similar to what 2016 was for Erdogan, where they forcefully tried to remove him from power
Mm-hmm.
and force him to really pick a side and reconsider his loyalties. And keep in mind, Orban was much more pro-Western than Erdogan was much more pro-Western than Orban ever really was. So it's going to be a situation like that, and it's going to be an all-or-nothing proposal, a zero-sum game where they either have to remove Orban from power in Hungary, or they lose Hungary either way, because if they fail to remove him through force, he'll drift closer and closer to Russia. But if there is an actual attempt on him, he's going to be burning bridges. Hungarians are going to be completely dissatisfied with the European Union. At that point, you might actually get an exit from the European Union if it does go that far. Keep in mind, Turkey was only part of NATO. It was trying to get into the EU for years, but it was never officially within the
Decades.
decades, excuse me, and it never succeeded at that. So I see this, and this is a very delicate game, but I think they're at the point where they're desperate and irrational enough, at least to a degree, to try something like this, which is either going to send a message to other similar quote unquote dissident countries to fall in line, or is going to push them away even further. But if they're going to try something in Hungary over the course of the next year, they're going to have to put everything they have into it, because it's not something they can afford to lose if there's an attempt at it. In which case, I'm trying to think that more and more likely there will be an attempt at it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Hungary has going for it is that it has very low debt, and that's because Orban has managed the economy very well, and it still has its own currency. It does not use the euro, um, which may be a reason why, um, when the EU is making threats on Poland and Hungary, why they're more successful with Poland rather than Hungary, even though Hungary is, in their eyes, much more belligerent.
Absolutely. And if you had a Polish government that behaved like Orban, it would be gone. Poland is far too valuable of a piece in this game to let go that renegade. Now, Hungary they can tolerate. They don't like it. They don't like it at all, but they can tolerate it. To a certain extent, we're starting to see where the limits of their patience are, given the circumstances. But with that, if a more significant country tried something like this, it would be a non starter. They would face the full wrath of the European Union without a doubt.
Right, and they have to be planning something, because there have been more protests this week on weekdays, both in Moldova and in Czech Republic. Tens of thousands of people are showing up now. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. Um, uh, the Netherlands, largest aluminum factory, has declared bankruptcy. It's over. There is a
It's
deindustrialization of
Jover.
Europe that's it's very much a jover. Uh, we were discussing off air, one of the episodes where we talked about Spengler and how he said civilization in its winter period goes through its own kind of deindustrialization, depopulation of its cities. And maybe the most pertinent example is Rome, where, in the even in the early part of the fourth century, in the 300s, it still had this, Colosseum where all kinds of gruesome matches took place. And then in the early part of the fifth century, it's where shepherds took their sheep to graze. And a similar kind of thing is now happening in Europe in order to buoy up
Wait, so you're saying I'm going to get to graze my sheep in Madison Square Garden?
yes, it's going to
Oh,
happen.
yes!
It's going to be like 12 monkeys. Except there'll be like artisan shops that have goats, milk, cheese, and all that kind of thing. It'll be nice. Anyhow,
Return to tradition. See, like
yes.
everyone has been dogging on the Royal Light Clapsitarians, but you know what? Spangler says we're right. Okay,
Yes.
so try arguing
You know,
that. Thank you very much. Good night.
yes. That's the other thing is, I mean, I began reading Spengler at the end of 2013, like December, and got more and more into him in 2014. And I literally would talk because I started to understand the theory, and I would literally talk to people and tell them what was coming. And actually, the war in Ukraine only reinforced what I believed was happening. And I had some people. I remember in 2016, I was at a housewarming party, and one guy, architect, and he said, "I remember what you said last year, and I can't believe it. It looks like it's happening. How did you know?" This kind of thing. But anyways, that's an aside. We've spoken about inflation. Inflation in Europe now is through the roof. Like, even if they get their gas, they won't have an economy.
Oh no,
Is
yeah, they'll be able to keep the lights on, but what are they gonna do with that? But I mean, and at that point, so many of the companies, and I'll get into some of the news about that, about BASF's moves, where they will have divested from Europe in favor of somewhere like America, China, or even somewhere in the developing world, that it's not going to be worth it to set up operations because Europe, to its credit, has very stringent regulations for workers. At least most countries do, and I know it can be used as a bit of a bludgeon, but they also are pretty good on environmental protection. Those are two things I'll give European laws. But with that being said, it's going to make business in Europe much more costly as opposed to heading to the US, in which case you can skirt around a lot of those, especially somewhere like China, you can skirt around a lot of those, and especially somewhere like the third world, you can skirt around a lot of those if they set up operations in any of these places. Hell, maybe if Bolsonaro pulls off his election, he'll turn Brazil into just into some manufacturing hub. I don't know. It seems like something he would try to do or whatever. But point being is, you're going to have this massive divestment from Europe, and at this point, it's not going to be worth it to return, even if conditions do approve. So Europe, while it may not fall into third world status if they can get their gas, it's going to become extremely irrelevant. And it's going to be a competition of, are they going to be in the pocket of Russia or are they going to be in the pocket of America? And I hate to say that. I wish Europe was doing better. I think in terms of Western influence, continental Europe is far preferable to the Anglosphere, but I think that's just the reality we're looking at right now.
Yeah. And they are afraid of Europe going this way. The other thing I thought about from our last episode is, I mean, America, of course, wants and needs more control over Europe. This is an act of consolidation. But can it really afford to pay for Europe? I don't believe it can. Um, you have, for instance, Egypt has declared that they are moving away from the American dollar. It will no longer be pegged to it, and they are going to peg their dollar to other world currencies, particularly those in BRICS. Now, speaking of BRICS, Saudi Arabia has asked to join BRICS and is considering the Shanghai Agreement as well, right? So, um, like, you know, this is what scares me, that America might do something, might it sees no option but to do something completely dramatic in Europe, in Ukraine, in order to hold on, because it still needs a Europe that is firmly under its control, but on the other hand, it can't have a broke Europe
Yeah,
either.
that goes back to what I've been saying. The United States doesn't need Europe for any strategic or economic reasons. It needs Europe to deprive Europe of being a power bloc in and of itself, or to deprive it of being aligned with Russia. Because those are the two most realistic options for Europe, and especially after the absolute economic cratering, it seems that cooperation with Russia is going to be. Once all the dust settles, I think even pragmatically, a lot of Europeans are going to realize that I mean, even as opposed to China, Russia's going to be really their only option to even be functional countries. I don't say that as some like massive Russophile. I mean, you all know my opinions on Russia at this point, and I don't think that we're going to see like Russian troops exercising off the coast of Portugal. I don't think
Yeah.
we're going to see any Russian naval bases in the what the hell are those islands off the coast of Portugal? What are those, the Azores?
The Azores,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's
My
why.
my
That's
friend is from the Azores,
oh, very
from high
nice.
school.
Can he hook me up with some nice island residency? I could use that right about now. You know, if Europe's gonna freeze death, I'm gonna go to the warmest part of Europe. So
Yeah,
that's just my
that's right.
personal opinion. You know, maybe a nice Malta, maybe I don't know somewhere. No, the Greek islands, that's too liable to break out with war at Turkey anytime. You know, things to consider, things to consider. But I'll put aside my personal escape plans for the time being, at least. But with that being said, in all seriousness, the United States needs to find a balance. The American empire needs to find a balance where Europe is poor but still keeping its head above the water. Much like they want the American working class, if you actually think about it. They want it to the point where it's just barely self sustainable, but not sustainable enough to actually be mobile and independent. And that's the position they're trying to get it in. They've overplayed their hand a bit, and now we're scrambling in order to get it back to that position, because I would say that's where Europe has been mostly since the end of World War II. Now, while you have had powerful European economies, they have been dwarfed by the United States. But there's just been a complete and absolute cratering of European economies to the point where they're getting to the point where it's going to be they're poor enough to actually take action because they don't have much less left to lose. Whereas before, and what they're trying to get back to now, is they need them just poor enough to keep their heads above the water.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not much I can add to that.
And with that being said, I just do have a few more European stories. So, as I had mentioned, BASF is downsizing across Europe, and that's not in just Germany. And they do say it is a permanent downsizing. They will be moving to places like China, like the United States, and even possibly the developing world. But for now, it's been the U.S. and China have been the ones who are really reaping the benefits of the divestment from Europe, and it's becoming to the point where again it's just too expensive to operate in Europe. Even if the gas would come back, the economy would just be too destroyed to even touch. Now, with BASF being a German company, you also have German inflation up at 10.2 officially now. If we're getting to real numbers, that is probably much higher. I'd like to see the shopping receipts of some Germans. I imagine we have plenty of Germans in the audience, so if any of you would like to give us some figures, or I don't know, maybe how your personal standard of living has been affected by this recent conflict, that would be welcome. You have some speech codes that are coming out of Germany that are set to press down anyone who is openly supporting Russia, and that you can be charged with quote unquote justification of war crimes if you do question any of the narratives in Ukraine. So, I don't know if you're watching the show in Germany, VPN's probably the best part, and if I had a VPN sponsorship, this would be the part where I would shill it. But we're not that important yet. But nah, I don't do this for the money. I do this because it's actually kind of fun, believe it or not. I have a twisted sense of fun, but here we are. But just fair warning to Germans that if you speak out too vocally on the Ukraine issue against the regime narrative, you could land yourself with fines and jail time. So be careful with that. On a similar note, Poland has declared Russia a terrorist state, along with Lithuania, which means it's going to be, man, those are two European powerhouses I would not want to go up against personally. But that's just me. Russia is quaking in its boots. Uh, General North FC is probably going to resign. He's probably going to commit Sudoku, as generals do in such a time of shame and disappointment. I would be quaking. Putin's probably getting ready to flee the country right now. Hell, Putin's probably going to the Azores right now, if I had to guess. But yeah, that's the news out of Poland. Just more of a funny story than anything. Germany is dismantling a wind farm in order to make way for coal mining and coal plants because the energy crisis has gotten to that. You have some trade disputes between Europe where Scholz and Macron are trying to get Biden to capitulate on some trade issues, particularly related to energy. And once again, it's just colonies trying to bargain with their masters who are currently at this point pushing them to their absolute logical extent. So I don't expect much to come out of that. You do have in a Macron style move. Macron is attempting via the Vatican to get the Pope to call on Putin to try to begin negotiations in Ukraine. So there is that avenue at least, and I can imagine if they're able to break some ground, that would probably cause a pretty rash response from the United States. At that point, I would consider the dirty bomb like a likelihood because let's say Macron's harebrained scheme of he calls up the Pope who has been all things considered pretty neutral in this conflict and actually has been somewhat critical of NATO, who calls up Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, who talks to Putin, and they try to use that as the groundwork for some sort of negotiation, some sort of peace summit. Oh, all of a sudden, dirty bomb in Odessa and Mykolaiv. I could see a scenario playing out like that if this actually goes anywhere. Now, for the time being, I don't think this will go anywhere, but that's something to keep your eye on. And then, I think to put the cherry on top of all of our European stories, you have Anthony Blinken coming out and saying that NATO countries need to increase their spending to the agreed upon 2%. And this is at a time when Europe is being economically gutted by none other than the United States. And then you have Blinken coming out and saying, we need you to pay your fair share. And when Trump said it, there was actually a bit of a point to this. Because you had Europe that was doing relatively economic well. You didn't have the sanction on Russia. You still had German industry as a titan. Germany was still one of the largest economies of the world at that point. Europe was in a state of relative peace to the point where, again, they were doing energy trade with Russia. And Trump comes along and says, 2%, come on, you need to meet your requirements. That is lambasted. That is dragged up and down the street. Then you have Blinken coming out after American policy has demolished their pipelines and pressured them to put these sanctions on Russia, saying, come on, guys, we need your 2%. Yes, sir. How much, Mr. Blinken? And I do have to say, on a similar vein, I should have brought this up with the Twitter story, is you had one of these European Union officials tweeting out that he was quote tweeting Elon Musk, who said the bird is now free, saying, well, actually, Twitter in Europe still has to adhere to our European flag emoji values. And at that point, it just means Twitter needs to conform in Europe to enforcing the U.S. State Department's will on Europe. So, really, distinction without a difference, but hey, here we are, I guess. I mean, once again, showing the absolute and complete subjugation and domination of Europe. At this point, I know I've been saying it for years, and it has been a bit dramatic and exaggerating on my part, and on the part of some people in these spheres, but once again, I feel that the War Report is vindicated in saying that Europe is a massive American colony and has been for 75 years.
Right. There was a interesting tweet a few days ago where one guy says, it's cute that Europeans thought that they were going to get away with having the Marshall Plan and like not pay someday for it, right? Uh, Americans love to gloat like that. And there's a guy, I don't follow him. And of course, I'm kind of partly suspended on Twitter. I can't follow any new
You're in
accounts
Twitter
until
purgatory.
yeah, I am in Twitter purgatory. Anyways, he's called something like Rozagovsky respecter, and he replies, "This is why Stalin never took the Marshall Plan. Um, because it's a question of sovereignty, and they gave up their sovereignty, and so now they have to go with every stupid American escapade that they can dream of, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria." Or and you notice how every year they've lost more and more power in being able to say no. Because like you look at Iraq, you know, Bush Jr. called it the coalition of the willing,
Yeah, and at that
which
point you had
included
France and
many
Germany abstaining from the Iraq War, and that and I'm sure you'll all remember. Well, at least some of our older audience members, you certainly remember the freedom fries and the pouring
yeah,
down of French wine down the streets. So you
that
had
was so
that.
stupid. What
Yeah.
what what a
Look,
historically
I'm going to McDonald's and ordering my freedom fries, okay? And if you don't like that, you're a communist.
yeah. It's typical like American conservative cringe. Uh, that shit, I hated it then and I hate it now. And like a
Okay,
lot of
maybe it's
conservatives have
because
learned their
I
lessons after that.
maybe it's because I can't remember it, but I don't know. The phrase "freedom fries" I can't say without laughing.
Oh yeah, it was it was one of the most retarded things. I know in Canada we laughed about it.
Of course you did. Yeah, right before like going above and beyond what America does. I mean, that's just the Canadian ethos. I'm not here to criticize. I'm just here to point out
Yeah,
facts.
yeah. It's but I mean it looked retarded all over the world, calling them freedom fries because they had the word French in it. Um, and
It is unironically the exact same thing we started doing to anything associated with Russia upon the outbreak of the war. In which case, that was even more aggressive in Europe. So,
oh yeah.
yeah, like it's. I mean that dwarfs freedom fries in like such an unbelievable sense when anything vaguely associated with Russia was just banned.
I mean, Sweden banned the balalaika musical instrument from their orchestras, right? Russian blue cats and Samoyed dogs were banned from dog and cat shows. Russian oaks were banned from arbor shows, right? It's like one thing after another. That's how. I mean, they banned Dostoevsky, of course, and then those got retracted.
You know, a lot of
But
these put a few nails in the coffin of, well, actually, these were all Ukrainian.
yes, of course.
Yeah. Well, you see, actually, they are Ukrainian, but we have to ban them because they're Russian.
Yeah, so you have, I mean, part of the problem is, I understand they can't help it, right? Like they've lost everything. They've lost the demographics war, they've lost the cultural war, they've lost everything. And the military and the world dominance of America is like the last thing that they can feel good about. And it was still true during the Iraq War. Uh, that didn't go very well, I think, after the first uh, um, the first term under Bush. It lost support, and it basically paved the way for Obama. But that's still there. And the only difference is now is you have shitlibs who are as bad or worse than the conservatives, the early 2000s.
Well, they had woken up from a brief stupor from the 80s to the 2010s, in which case you had a brief right wing surge in America, and realized the empire was always a liberal project.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a painful one for them to understand.
Yeah, I mean like
Like
I
the
said,
separation of
you
church
might.
and state was so that the state could come up with its own religion. Like
Yeah,
they're just beginning to understand that now.
separation of church and state, so Estonia can force Orthodox churches onto different jurisdictions by
Yeah.
by state power, or separation of church and state, so we can cause a schism in Ukraine for our geopolitical goals. You see, but nuns have to pay for birth control. Okay, that's like they can't have it. It's I mean. Once again, I can't expect these people to be consistent with their principles, but it's just absurd. But I do just have a few more pieces of news for the episode. So returning to that, I have a few pieces of Middle Eastern news. So a little bit of a funny one is that Biden had some false hope that an oil deal with Saudi Arabia would pan out before the midterms. This was supposed to be a secret deal that once again Mohammed bin Salman just completely tossed in the garbage and said, "No, we're not doing this." And there was that. And then you do have some brief news out of Syria. The skirmishes in northeast Syria do continue, but more significantly, at least this week, there are explosions that were rocking a U.S. base out of Deir Zor. So this is the second time within a week, and this was on October 26th, which was this Wednesday, that there were rocket strikes on the American base there. And this was after that one village in northeastern Syria had American forces routed bloodlessly, mind you. There was no exchange of fire. There was exchange of fire in a different context, but there was no exchange of fire in this particular example when Syrian forces managed to chase out American occupation forces from a village in northeastern Syria. There were some skirmishes between them also in northeastern Syria within that same time period, but now you have more strikes on the U.S. base in Deir ez-Zor. And this is on top of the instability in Iran currently. This is on top of the attempts to revive the JCPOA. This is on top of also the attempts between Saudi Arabia and Iran to reestablish diplomatic relations. So this is at a time where once again American power is waning, and I would say the most evident place where American power is waning is in the Middle East, to the point where if something like this would have happened even 2 years ago, because I remember shortly after the Soleimani assassination, there were some attacks on American forces in Iraq, and you had Trump out there in front of the press saying, "We're going to respond to this. The Iranians have an off ramp. They can back down from this, so they'll also see overwhelming force." To the point where you have these rocket attacks on American forces in Deir ez-Zor that go completely unnoticed, and you have. And like I said, this is the second time in a week you've had this going on since the beginning of the Biden administration. I mean, all Biden has done in the Middle East in terms of aggression is he struck some pro-Iranian groups in Syria all the way back in February 2021 and has completely left the theater alone since then. Look, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's frankly a good thing, but you do have American forces there who were probably originally there as a tripwire, serving that purpose to no response. And in my opinion, it's a look of illegitimacy. It makes you look like a fool. It makes you look weak. You can point to a lot of the Russian military failures in Ukraine this during this war, but I think the American conduct in the Middle East over the past year and a half, 2 years, really puts all of that to shame. And at this point, again, you've had Americans who were invested in the Middle East for so long, and you've had it as such a focal point, the point where, again, defeating ISIS was one of the largest campaign points in 2016. What's your plan to stop ISIS? What's your plan to do X, Y, or Z? To the point where you have these remnant American forces left over just getting rockets lobbed at them, and nobody cares.
Yeah. Speaking of Syria, there's been now the Russians began a sweep in Daria region. They took out like 18 to 20 ISIS fighters, but today in the house of a former rebel, a suicide bomber ran in and killed himself and four individuals who I presume are fighting uh, with the Syrians, the nationalist forces. The other interesting thing that's happened is today they discovered the body of a Sharia judge in Yassim, again in the Dara region. Faleh Shehadeh Al-Azizi. This guy was in a different rebel group, and then after 2000 2018, when his rebel group was destroyed, he decided to join ISIS. So Kirby, sticking with Syria, Kirby said that the U.S. has no more than 1,000
And that's
soldiers.
Tim Kirby, correct?
Yes, Tim Kirby, thank you. Um, said that I mean the U.S. Diplomat or spokesman for the Pentagon. Um, I don't know if his name is Tim, but so
Oh no, Tim
Kirby.
Kirby's the Telegram guy.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah, different Kirby. So he said that they have no plans from withdrawing from Syria or ending the sanctions on Syria, or I guess stealing their wheat and stealing their oil and so on and so on. Um, yeah, only 1,000 guys, and for the first time, they're coming under attack from unknown forces. These could even be like Syrian forces that are not technically officially part of the Syrian army for diplomatic reasons and for the possibility of retaliation.
Yeah, there's all kinds of
But it's a
government-aligned,
second
non-affiliated
direct
groups.
attack on their base in 2 weeks. So yeah, they want them out, and Erdogan wants them out. Just about everybody wants them out except Israel.
Yeah, except Israel and the United States, which at that point in that region at least is a distinction without a difference. And with that being said, you're going to continue to run into problems with resettlement because there has been discussion of resettlement of Syrian refugees between Syria and Lebanon, as well as Syria and Turkey, and that will be continued to be stymied while they are being
Yeah.
deprived of, once again, the most basic needs of fuel and food. And that's the entire point of the American occupation force at this point. And
Right, and you can see why Erdogan is right to let them loose into Europe. He's right because America that is like America basically wants a situation where uh, uh, the refugees can't leave Turkey. They become a burden and a problem for Turkey. That could be used for a regime change as one factor amongst other factors, right? Keeps Syria destabilized from life returning to normal because the more it does, it disqualifies the legitimacy of America being in Syria in the first
well, I
place.
mean, the whole refugees in Turkey thing is really a win-win because they stay in Turkey, they're a destabilizing force there. If they go to Europe, they're a destabilizing force there as well.
Right, right. But I'm saying if Erdogan, if there was a way, he really should let them loose, all 4 million of them, into Europe. I mean, I hate to say it, I hate to see it, but that's what I mean. Europe has to do
I
something.
mean, and again, I hate to say it, but that is what they're asking for. The way Europe has conducted itself, it's saying, please send 4 million refugees. We can certainly handle it. Like, and that's not only recently, but since 2015, that is the way they conducted themselves. So when Erdogan does it, you can't be surprised.
Right now, they tried to stop him before, but again, um, eventually, money in Europe is going to start to run out, and Erdogan won't be able to house them. And that 4.5 million is going to go somewhere. And I would say a good portion of it is not going to go back to Syria. But they could make it easy. They could make it easy and allow them to go back to Syria to make Syria, a normal place to live in. In the big cities, it is. Now, there have been some attacks on the outskirts of Damascus by Israelis trying to, destroy their airports and whatnot. But the Israelis are not they're not the problem that the Americans are, because Americans occupy uh, large swaths of land in Syria. And moreover, they coordinate with the Turks and other Islamists and with Islamist groups, right? That prolong the war, which is what America wants. They are determined that as long as Assad is alive, Syria will be burning. And for Europe, I mean, I know they're under American hegemony, so you know, hate to say it, but death to America. It's the only good thing that could ever happen because they're just prolonging this for no reason. when this war could have been resolved years ago. And as usual, America makes it worse for Europe. And
I
a
mean,
lot of Europeans don't see it that way.
they're complete whipping boys, and all they can say is, well, why isn't America progressive enough on this relevant issue? That's the only substantial criticism you can ever get of Europeans. You know, they can ever get of America from Europeans, and Frank, and again, like, I don't blame Europe as a whole for cooperating with the American system, because they're built into it. To escape would take bloodshed, frankly.
Oh, it would be a war.
Oh, absolutely. It would have to be a European war of independence. And I don't know, it may come to that. Maybe that is the morally right thing to do in the greater sense, in terms of your obligation to a civilization. Maybe a European war of independence is something that needs to happen. I can't say for certain, but once again, there's one thing of living with reality, but you get this from so many Europeans, especially European elites, where they want to go above and beyond. They want to please their masters, and frankly, that's the part I find disgusting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I detest it. And it's the same thing in Canada. Canada sees California and says, hold my beer. That's the whole nature of Canada. You know, look, if you dig a little deeper, you're going to find places up north, places in Alberta that are more, or on the East Coast that are more conservative than that. You know, it doesn't reflect on them just the way you can find in America or many other
But the
countries.
prevailing culture in Canada,
But the
once again,
prevailing
like,
culture, the culture that actually has a voice, the culture that actually has power. And by the way, like when we look at culture, archaeologically speaking, what we're looking at is what the elites determined that culture was, right? Not like whatever plebeian was against it.
yeah, and again, and I get the point you're trying to make, but like, yeah, you can find holdouts in places like Alberta. That's like saying West Virginia is uncharacteristically a conservative state.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's based, but it's tolerable. I've gone to Alberta many times.
Well, I
I
would say
have
West
a good
Virginia is
friend
based, but
there.
that's a conversation for a different day.
Yeah.
uh, but
I mean, it's I would rather be there than Ontario, but
oh, absolutely. um, but that's all I had for the Middle East, and then just some brief China news. Now, this came to my
there
attention.
is one more story
Oh,
though.
yeah, no, go ahead then.
So there was a terrorist attack in Iran. 15 worshippers were killed, and across 5 different Iranian cities, including Qom, QOM. This is the second place that the coronavirus actually blew up, even though it only had 2 Chinese residents there. Think about that. Remember the military and religious staff that died in the weeks right after coronavirus? I think there was always a lethal form of it that was actually weaving its way. It's really weird that it just jumped from China to Iran. Anyhow, so uh, two, three uh, assassins or murderers, terrorists, went into a mosque, shot up everybody there. They turned out to be um, ISIS. 2 of them were killed. One of them was captured later. He died in hospital. And there are massive protests now in the millions. If you gather the 5 largest cities together, it's 2.4 million or something like that.
Well, in that case, that
So
probably has the dwarf the previous protest movements, at least I'd imagine.
yeah. Oh, this is this is a big deal. It's a shock. It's a shock, particularly how close they could hit. Right. Um, And it just goes to show you, ISIS never attacks Israel. It only attacks enemies of Israel or enemies of America.
Man, I mean, while there has been cases just to keep up appearances, they seldom attack any American or American line forces either.
Ever. That not that I mean, Americans will take them out. Sometimes they'll let them live. Sometimes they'll take them out. You know, what's the
I
rationale?
mean, the
It's
most you ever
often it's for like media narrative spinning. I you know some of them might have gone rogue. They're
Yeah,
not
and like,
doing, they're underperforming. And the CIA has taken out clients of theirs that are underperforming before. Let's say the war starts to go really bad for Ukraine, right? Like, who's going to take out Zelensky? It won't be the Russians. It'll either be Azov or it'll be the CIA that'll take him out.
yeah, and again, like the most like ICE activity gotten in America are like the San Bernardino thing, where they will like pledge allegiance to ISIS, but like it's never like these
Yeah, yeah.
plotted out things or that like one Orlando thing. It's always like these individuals who like are ISIS aligned and never part of the actual organization. But no, they don't attack
Hmm,
American
hmm.
forces. American forces will attack them. They will clean them up. They will tie up loose ends. But it's almost always targeted towards once again non-American aligned forces. And hell, maybe given the recent activity, we'll start to see ISIS activity in Saudi Arabia in the near future. I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see that, but I think that's really the only direction it can go, especially considering the fact that they're going to have to try a palace coup. But I did hear about that in Iran. I didn't realize the backlash was so large to that. And frankly, I would say, if anything, that would be the one thing that has actually had the potential to put down any sort of protest or anti-regime movement, is showing that again, that's something, and not to sound like too cynical or Machiavellian about it, that's something they can play on. They can say, well, look, you may not be satisfied with this because of X, Y, or Z, but look, we're the ones who can keep you safe from these foreign
Hmm.
aligned attacks. And it's, I can't imagine that this was, I mean, and again, that's where I run into the question. Was this a foreign aligned attack? Because they probably knew in that case it would result in something like this. Or was this just an ideological radical who wasn't necessarily tied to any organization or acting at the behest of any organization? But either way, I mean, it has shored up the Iranian regime probably for the near future if things like this do continue to happen.
Yeah.
But with that,
Yeah. Yeah.
if
Nope.
if you have anything else left on that, certainly. If
No.
not, we can get into some of our news regarding China. Now, this came up while I was doing the show. Taiwan, now this is from Reuters. Taiwan celebrates diversity, equality in East Asia's largest Pride March. So that was today on October 29th. And yeah, that's nice. It's beautiful to see that Taiwan is pledging fealty to the civic religion of the empire. And it really is an attempt to do just that. And it is interesting. I think about this every once in a while when the question of Taiwan comes up, that Taiwan, or the Republic of China officially, was founded as a government in exile by Chiang Kai shek, who was the leader of the nationalist forces in the Civil War. And the man saw himself as Chinese. He saw himself as a Chinese leader in exile, somebody who would want to see the mainland and Taiwan united one day. Now, under his regime, I mean, but at this point, I think if he were alive today, he would probably support CCP control of the entirety of China and Taiwan. But you do see this interesting movement where they're trying to forge the Taiwanese as an independent identity and as independent ethnicity, separate from China, and that, and again, it's this pseudo history of statelets. Rather than being a Chinese government in exile, they are an entity distinct from China who want to be separate from China, who want to be an independent nation, which does almost undermine the purpose of Taiwan. And again, you still have a very large pro mainland, pro CPC faction that exists within Taiwan. In fact, they just narrowly lost the last election. Probably the reason you haven't seen any aggressive force is because China believes there's a political solution to this. But once again, it's just going further down that rabbit hole of pledging fealty to the American empire, of being yet another American clone in the region, similar to the way much of, now not all of, but much of Japan and South Korea have fallen, and even arguably some places like the Philippines. But, I mean, even a massive Pride March goes beyond what you see in places like Japan and South Korea, and it is a desperate attempt to try to win the support of the empire because they are afraid that the system will all come crashing down. In which case, in the next few years, especially the American empire continues to recede like it is, I mean, it's probably what's going to happen. Taiwan will be absorbed one way or another, and it's a matter of when rather than if.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Xi Jinping said is they will, because I think the old target date was something like 2038 or 2040 something.
I think I saw
Oh,
back as far back as 2050, but I mean, but
yeah, I
yeah,
mean, we're talking uh, somewhere between a decade and a half to 2 decades, like closer to 2 decades, right? Over 15 years. That's a long way off. And, he said that they're going to speed that process up. And I think I think the strategy will probably be that China will begin developing its own semiconductors that they hope will be able to match for various purposes those of the TMSC plant. Right now, people will say like Russia's running out of semiconductors, or they're not. Um, Russia does make its own semiconductors, and they are used in the Kinjal and caliber hypersonic missiles. So that's what a low grade backwards semiconductor can do. It will evade. These are the hypersonic. These are not the regular cruise missiles that I'm talking about. That's what they can do, right? So you don't need necessarily like the most advanced chip manufacturing.
you just need
Uh,
functional chips.
yeah, right. Just think of a laptop, right? You have like some very high performing chips, but they overheat, so you have to find methods of cooling them down. Um, but that's a stopgap of one kind or another, right? So I would say that their strategy is basically to make Taiwan kind of as economically irrelevant as Hong Kong became irrelevant. Because by the early 90s, really, Hong Kong was not like the financial center of China at all at that moment. And in the 2000s, it certainly wasn't, right? Uh, Probably one of the reasons why the Westerners didn't fight so hard to keep Taiwan. Sorry, Hong Kong. So it might be that a similar strategy is being employed.
Yeah, I would agree. And since you had brought that up, there is some news on Russian Chinese cooperation with that. So, China has said that it intends to support Russia in overcoming difficulties achieving strategic development goals, which is. And this was said by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in a conversation with Lavrov. So, there is, and as you were saying, with the caliber missiles and with the Russian higher tech weapons, that you don't really need that strong of a computer chip or whatever to actually make it function. It is shown that China does intend to develop this industry, and they do intend to cooperate with Russia on that. Once again, solidifying the relationship that they already have.
Yeah, I mean those high performing chips, I would guess, are more important for, I think, surveillance, satellites, um, let's say aircraft.
Yeah, and then I just do have one last piece of China news, and this ties back into the European news. Is that the German government plans to approve Chinese takeover of, once again, the chip production company. Um, so you see more German industry heading overseas to China in particular, reaping the benefits of the industrial collapse of Europe.
Hmm.
And that is all I had for this week. If you have any last minute stories, so we can certainly fit them in. If not, I can go ahead and bring us to a close.
I guess we'll do Putin's speech some other time.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. We'll do it some other time. Yeah, let's do that.
So thank you everyone for tuning in this episode of the War Report. This will be a special episode that premieres on the day of, but of course be sure to check out our other platform as well. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thank you and take care.